Okay, well, welcome everyone. This is a Healthy Ireland at Your Library talk. Today we are very privileged to have with us Nicola Morgan, very well-known author, and she has 4 books at the moment in our Healthy Ireland collection. They are Blame My Brain, Positively Teenage, The Teenage Guide to Life Online, and The Teenage Guide to Stress. And we are also very lucky because Nicola is kindly sending us 2 other books. And Nicola, do you want to just mention those books now?
Yes, so they're the 2 books that were published this year. The Awesome Power of Sleep, which was published in January, all about teenage sleep, although there's not much difference between teenage sleep and everyone else's sleep, it's just sleep. And then the most recent book is called Be Resilient. So that's a guide that was triggered by the pandemic, but really is to cover any of the storms, big or small, that people come across throughout their lives.
Great, thank you. So today Nicola is going to talk with us about teenagers and online behaviours. Now, I suppose particularly as you've mentioned the pandemic there, Nicola, this is one of the things that we've all become very online focused over the last year or 2, thanks to COVID. And there are a number of impacts from that. So I suppose, could you talk us through sort of screens and screen usage and the impacts that it has on our health?
Yes, so I think the first thing to say is that it's really important for everyone, whatever age we are, to recognise that different people are affected differently. And we often see, we most commonly see very negative media headlines saying or implying that there's going to be harm to young people, whoever they are and whatever age they are. And that just isn't the case. Some people find much more negative effects than others. Different groups of people, different subgroups of people will find different effects. And one of the kind of central messages that I like to give, whether I'm talking to adults or to young people, is that what we all need to do is be very, very self-aware and very honest about how it seems to be affecting us. So without looking at or without taking too much notice of headlines, just to look at how is it affecting you, how is it making you feel? Because as well as the negative effects, and there are negative effects, there are lots of positive effects as well. And you mentioned the pandemic in your question. And yes, during that time, we have obviously, understandably, all of us been spending, or most of us been spending a lot more time on our screens, whether it's for work or for school or for keeping connected to our friends. And that extra use has brought some benefits. And I think we need to be quite honest and quite analytical to work out what those benefits have been so that we can continue to enjoy those benefits as we come out, we hope, of the pandemic. But also to really recognise and be honest about how it might be affecting us badly. So notice on an individual level, rather than looking at the statistics, on an individual level, am I, and encourage your teenagers to ask this question of themselves as well, am I on my screens more often than I intend to and more often than I feel is good for me? Am I finding that this means that I'm sleeping less well, I'm doing less physical activity, I'm having less face-to-face or individual contact with people? And if that's the case, if those effects are happening, what do I feel I should do about it, and what can I do about it? So it's about being individual and self-aware and analytical and honest about the effects on us as individuals, rather than what the statistics or what the headlines seem to show us.
Okay, and you mentioned there, being aware of the impacts that your online usage is having on you. So what typically might you see in a teenager with, I suppose, excessive screen use, or maybe where you might have concerns about screen use?
Yes, so one of the questions that I very, very often get from both young people and adults, which is very similar to that question, is how long is it okay to spend on a screen, and how do I know when I'm spending too much time on screen? And there isn't an honest science-based answer to that question, particularly the first question, how long is it okay to spend on a screen? Because it's not the amount of time that we spend on screen, because all of the things that we might do on screens are very different as well. Some of the things are very beneficial and useful, and some of the things are less so. So what I say, instead of asking how long you've spent on the screen, is look at certain healthy, necessary behaviors or activities that we know are really important for our physical and mental health, and see if they are being impacted and I'm doing less of them. So those activities, and there are 5 of them, so there are 5 really healthy, necessary things that we, all of us, whether we're adults or young people, should be doing enough of in order to have a healthy life, and which overuse of screens prevents us from having enough of. And they are sleep. So we need to look at whether our sleep is being affected. Is it taking us longer to get to sleep, or are we going to sleep too late and therefore having not enough sleep? So sleep, physical activity, including and particularly going outside and getting fresh air and activity outside. Face-to-face activity, so face-to-face communication, which we know is really important for mental health. Reading for pleasure and other offline hobbies. And finally, and when I ask the question in a face-to-face audience, what do you think are the activities that healthy activities that we're doing less of now that we're doing more time on screen? Most people get those previous 4, but they mostly don't come up with the 5th one, which is time to think, time just to, I call it mental composting. That's not just my word, actually. I've seen that word used before. Time where you're not actively focusing on something. You've not got more information coming in, but you're just allowing your mind to drift. The sort of thing which, if we were on a bus or in a car as a passenger, we might just be looking out of the window and just letting thoughts come in. That turns out to be really important. You might think that's a waste of time, you know, what's so special about that? But it turns out from a lot of research that having some periods of time, even if it's just a couple of minutes at a time during the day, when your mind is not receiving more information and you're able just to drift and think, is really important for several reasons. It's important for processing information that you have just received. So thinking about a teenager who's been at school all day, then having time, for example, on the way home, on a bus or in the car, or even just walking, and not being on your phone receiving more information, but having that time just to let your mind drift, allows and helps the information that you were trying to learn during the day to process. And at the same time, at lunchtime or in break times, allowing yourself to have those times to think and daydream. It also turns out to be important for mental health to have those times when your mind is still or relatively still. And it also turns out to be really important for creativity. And if you ask somebody who works as a creative person or who relies on having new ideas and being creative, and ask them when they get their ideas, you won't find anyone say, oh, I get my ideas when I'm on my phone or on my screen or whatever. They get their ideas when they're walking or looking out of the window or doing the ironing or whatever it is, something that occupies a small amount of your mind. So those 5 things, if you look at your life and you see that you're doing less of them than feels appropriate, or you're doing less of them than you did before you were using your screens so much, then that to me is a sign that because I'm very guilty of this as well, have got the balance wrong. And that applies equally to adults as it does to young people. But another, again, to answer the question, how do you know, or how might you suspect that your young person is using a screen too much? One thing that they are very aware of, and probably the thing that that a young person will most often ask me in a spirit of feeling concerned and wanting advice, is this idea of accidental procrastination, where, for example, they have gone to their room or sat down intending to do their homework or some revision or whatever it is they've got to do, and instead of getting straight into the work, they've picked up their phone to see if there are any notifications or whatever, or they've got their phone on and a notification comes in, and then they start scrolling. And you probably, as I do, know this feeling of thinking, oh, I'll just spend 2 minutes or 5 minutes or even 10 minutes on my device before I start working. But before you know it, 45 minutes or an hour or longer than that has gone past. And that can create a really stressed feeling for that young person, because they realize, they know they've just wasted that amount of time when they actually needed to be getting their work done. And then they have to rush their work and it doesn't go so well, and that doesn't feel good. And that's that has an effect of lowering their self-esteem and mental health, because they actually look at themselves and think, oh, why did I do that? How did that happen? And how could I not be more in control? So keeping lines of communication open and allowing your young person to express those feelings of stress when they've overused their phones is a very good thing to do.
Okay, and sometimes people suggest, teenagers should maybe leave their phones down, put them away over dinner and things like that. I mean, what are your thoughts around, I suppose, creating a situation where they're comfortable doing that?
Yes, so I think that there's a lot of variety there depending on the age of the young person that you're talking about. And, with, let's say, an 11-year-old, you as the adult have a lot more power and duty to set stricter guidelines than you can for a 15 or 16-year-old, where with that older age of teenager, you need it to be much more negotiated and much more agreed with their input. It's actually also useful to have their input as a younger person as well, but it's easier for you to set strong, robust guidelines for a younger adolescent than it is for a 15 or 16-year-old. So letting them in on the conversation, letting them become informed about why it is that we as a family, as a household, are going to make some guidelines, what those guidelines are informed by, not just informed by the adult thinking that the teenager should do such and such, but informed by what are the healthy behaviors, what are the unhealthy behaviors, how are we going to make it easy for ourselves as a family, as a household, to have healthy behaviors, then deciding what they are. And amongst what those healthy behaviors are, it feels to me very important that there should be some unbreakable, or as unbreakable as possible, guidelines which every member of the household, absolutely including the adults, follows. And that should be certain times where, as you suggest, we, all of us, keep our phones not just off, but out of sight, because when a phone is in sight, it changes people's behaviors. We know that when a phone is in sight, even if it's switched off, it spoils your concentration, for example, on a piece of work. We know that your performance on the piece of work will tend to drop slightly, but that might be an important amount. We also know that when a phone is in sight, it doesn't even have to be your phone, it's a phone, somebody else's in the household's phone is in sight. It changes the nature of the conversations that happen. So, for example, if you're around the dinner table, or even there's just two of you, a parent and a teenager, let's say, having a conversation or having a coffee in the kitchen, if a phone is in sight, it can change the nature of the conversation between you and make it more shallow. So it makes the people involved less likely to have a deep and meaningful conversation, or to say what they're really thinking or what they're really concerned about. And the thinking behind why that is the case seems to be that when there's a phone there is a part of our mind, either consciously or subconsciously, that is saying to us, that phone might ring, or it might bring a notification, and the person whose phone it is will answer that phone. So they're not really going to be concentrating on me and what I might be about to say. And sure enough, a notification comes or the phone goes off, the owner of the phone does pick it up, and that distracts them from the conversation you're trying to have. And it seems to be that we anticipate that, and so we don't even bother, people of all ages, this happens to adults as well as to teenagers, that we don't bother to have those serious, those deep, those really involved and interested and engaged conversations with each other, because there's this object in front of us which is likely to distract the whole conversation. So it seems to me that amongst the guidelines, we should be, for example, and I'm not saying this is exactly what it should be, but these would seem to be good examples of times when we keep our phones out of the way. One is at family meal times, at meal times. Another is during the time before we're going to go to sleep. So I would say an hour and a half before we're going to go to sleep, but you can change that if you like. And the other time would be, well, two other times actually, when we're trying to work. So when we're trying to concentrate on a piece of work and do a good piece of work. And finally, when somebody is trying to talk to us. So when one of the things that teenagers often say to me in complaint is, when I want to talk to my parent, my parents' phone goes off, or my parents looking at their phone or whatever, and I don't feel that they're engaged with me. So at family meal times, before sleep, when we're trying to do a piece of work, and when somebody is trying to talk to us, would be times where it seems to me right and reasonable and evidence-based and useful that we all agree as a household that our phones will be out of sight, completely out of sight. And I think once young people understand why this would be a good idea, and really crucially see that we, the parents, are going to do that as well, and we're going to follow these guidelines because there's no reason not to, these are healthy for them and it's healthy for us, then they're much more likely to be to engage in the process and to feel good about it, and to notice the benefits when they do have these periods of time, quite short periods of time, when they are not going to have their phone out and visible.
Okay. And so I suppose one of the questions then, if we're talking about why we need to put phones away, why are phones and screens so addictive?
Yeah, so there are quite a few reasons, and one thing I should mention is that we've been talking about screens, and we've also specifically talked about phones, but we've been talking about them as though there's only one activity that we do on them. And we need to remember that there are lots of different sorts of screens and lots of different sorts of activity. Some of those sorts of activity are more compulsive or addictive than others. But yes, in general, screens of all sorts have this power to make us use them compulsively. And it seems to me that the main reason for this is to do with how our brains are wired. And human brains are wired in a very ancient way, from hundreds of thousands of years ago. And the wiring hasn't really changed since then. And our brains are wired to do things which give us a greater chance. And remember, I'm talking about hundreds of thousands of years ago, so in the way pre-technical age, give us a chance to survive or succeed, or both. And so our brains are wired to do many types of behaviors and to feel rewarded every time we do those behaviors. So the neurotransmitter dopamine in the brain is triggered when we're about to do any of the activities that our brain is wired to do, that our brain wants us to do for survival or success. And this is relevant to screens particularly, because three of the things that our brains are wired to do are to be social, to be curious, and to be distracted. So all three of those things, when we do them, they give us, with our ancient brain wiring, ways of being of surviving or being successful. So being social is important because humans survive and are successful largely because we are social. When we do things in collaboration, when we share information, when we protect each other. So it is critically important for humans to have social connections. That includes people like me who are introverted and don't like groups. It's not about whether you like groups or not. It's about the need to have connections. And when a human doesn't have connections, that has very bad, very negative effects on mental health. So we're wired to make connections. We're wired to be curious because being curious makes us learn things, and the more we learn, the more we know, the more likely we are in different ways to be successful. And we're wired to be distracted for survival reasons. So the old hunter-gatherers hundreds of thousands of years ago, if they were too good at focusing, they might not notice the lion creeping from the side or the snake slithering through the grass. So we're wired to be distractible, and particularly to be distracted by moving things. Now, if you think of us being wired to be constantly social, curious and distracted, and then you think of what our screens, all sorts of screens, give us, you realize that what they give us is constant, repeated over and over again, almost nothing but the ability to be social, curious and distracted, or any combination of those. So our screens, when we look at a normal computer, for example, and we're on the internet, whatever we're doing on it, whether we're reading something on a website or on Facebook or email or whatever it is, there are lots of things on the screen more than the actual words that we're trying to read. There are all the adverts, moving adverts, again, wired to be distracted. There are the hyperlinks. There are constant temptations to do something other than the thing we're doing. So we're not actually wired as humans to concentrate on one thing very well. We're wired to love all of this feast of things that give us reward every time. And the interesting thing about dopamine and reward is that that little dopamine buzz, that little pleasure buzz, doesn't come while we're doing the thing that we're wired to do. It comes in anticipation. So it's been shown that when we look at our phone, we're thinking, oh, is there going to be a notification? Or when we hear a notification ping in, we're thinking, oh, what's it going to say? It could be something nice. It could be, inviting me to do something, or saying something lovely to me, or liking my latest Instagram share, or whatever it is. It's the anticipation that gives us that dopamine buzz. So we're constantly seeking it. And so it is entirely not surprising when the more we do that, the more we want to do that, and the more we get sucked in, because of the anticipation of the pleasure that we might get when we open our phone and we do, or any device, and we do whatever it is we're intending to do. So they are relentlessly compulsive, and it's not an exaggeration to use the word addictive, as long as we understand that although addiction is one thing, there are lots of different types, lots of different things to be addicted to, lots of different processes, and not all things that we can be addicted to are as dangerous or problematic as others. And this is not one of the most dangerous or problematic ones compared to the other things that we can be addicted to. But understanding why our screens are so delicious and tempting is a really important start to finding ways to get control of that.
Okay. And you mentioned there, that human beings are wired to be social, and you also mentioned that you're an introvert. Now, I suppose one of the things about teenagers using screens is that they can be very helpful for teenagers who are maybe a little bit introverted, who may just be coming into their own, as they're developing their identities. So there are positives as well as negatives in terms of screen use. But are there any issues that you would see with someone who is introverted in using their screens?
Yes, because as you say, it is wonderful for all sorts of people, but one of the ways it's wonderful for introverts is that it does allow us to start off friendships and even to maintain friendships without that difficult thing of the face-to-face. But the key there as to why that can be a problem is in where I say that difficult thing. It is difficult. It's difficult for all sorts of people to have face-to-face conversations. It's a set of skills, and sets of skills need to be practiced. And having face-to-face conversations and being able to look somebody in the eye and to talk to a stranger and to meet new people and to engage with people that you don't know is a really important set of life skills. And the problem with it being so easy to make friends and make connections online is that you might be tempted only to do that. You might be tempted not to practice those skills of face-to-face conversation, and that would clearly be a problem. It's you know, we another thing we're wired to do is to do things that are easy, you know, not to spend extra brain energy doing something that's difficult, but that's something that in lots of contexts we need to resist. So yes, it can be too easy to hide behind that screen and not go out into the real world and have face-to-face conversations. It's different having a face-to-face conversation and needing to recognize somebody's body language and take turns, etc. Almost everything about having a conversation is different, even as I'm now doing this online. And you know, I can't see whether you're nodding or wanting me to stop talking, and you know, it's harder when you're doing things online. Well, harder in some ways, easier in other ways, but it's different anyway, a different set of skills. And so it would be a mistake if people felt that just because you can make friends online that was enough, because it isn't. And also, as I'm sure we've all experienced, sometimes you can have a friend online. I mean, I can think of quite a few people who I consider good friends of mine, but who I've hardly ever met in real life. And then I can think of occasions when I've engaged with someone quite a lot online, and you know, and seeing them as well, so seeing them on video, but then when I actually meet them, it's very different, and sometimes not always in a good way either. And I sometimes discover that I don't kind of feel the chemistry there when I meet them in real life. So it is important to realize that it's different, that it's useful, it's got real uses. And another way that it's useful in that context is when young people have a particular thing that applies to them and they can't find in their school, let's say, in their school setting, in their peer group, they can't find somebody else who has that same thing, whatever it is, situation or way of thinking or way of being or whatever. And it can be really so fantastically useful for them to meet somebody just like them online, but it isn't enough. We still do need to practice those life skills of face-to-face conversation.
And you've segued very nicely there into another question I have, which is around the types of people that you meet online. So as a, you know, an introverted teenager, or just a teenager generally, one of the appealing things about social media is that it lets you meet people who have interests in common with you. But there's another side to that, which is that obviously you can end up in a little bit of a bubble. So how do you, I suppose, guide and encourage your teenager to be aware of the issues around that?
I think that's a very good question, and very topical at the moment with all of the controversy about Facebook and the research that they appear to have hidden about that and about the problems with Instagram. But I think the answer to that is the answer to quite a lot of other aspects of problems that can occur through online use. And that is the need to keep talking. So to keep the communication going between the adults and teenagers. In a way, we're all learning this together. Well, in many ways, we're all learning this together. I don't think adults should fall into that trap of thinking that teenagers know everything about online and we don't. Actually, most of us have been online for longer than teenagers have. We're older, just that it's less of a proportion of our life. But in terms of number of years and the amount that we have learned about online life, we have been there for longer than teenagers have. So we have the opportunity to know more or as much, not necessarily in the same types of behaviours, but in terms of the overall picture, we have as much information as they do. So we're all learning it together. So let's keep talking about it together. Let's not pretend either that teenagers know more than us or that we know more than teenagers. Let's talk about it together. And that whole thing about bubbles and your view being able to be amplified in the little bubble of people who think just like you. You talk about the various controversies to do with vaccine denial, for example, COVID denial. You talk about what that means and how some groups of people can find themselves believing a conspiracy theory, let's say. Talk about all that, discuss it, talk about human nature and how we all like to have our group, we like to have our group of people, but that's not always a healthy thing if that group is promoting false information or unhealthy information. So I do think the answer is to keep talking and to try to be on a level, try to talk on a level with young people about it.
Thank you. And for teenagers then, would you have any recommendations around their, let's say, their behaviours online?
I think I guess there are two main areas, maybe three, but there are two main areas where teenagers themselves feel that there's a problem. One is, as I mentioned earlier, to do with the effect that it has on their concentration and on their work. And the other completely separate area is on the effect that social media can have, and Instagram has the worst reputation for this, so can have but won't always have, on people's mental health and self-esteem. And it seems to be fairly clear that the most vulnerable group in that respect, in that second respect, would be teenage girls. You know, over and over again we keep hearing, and again including in the recent ongoing thing about the Facebook leaks, is that it's young girls who seem to be more affected, more negatively affected by the self-esteem threats than other groups. But in terms of the concentration and focus and procrastination, it seems to me that that's equally the case for all groups, male, female, you know, all age groups and everything. And then I guess the third topic that I was thinking of would be the effect on sleep. And again, that's something that teenagers themselves find a problem. They recognize very often that they're not getting enough sleep, or that sleep is difficult for them. And they recognize that that's a problem because the effect is immediate and obvious, which is that you feel terrible during the day. And a lot of teenagers talk to me about that. So you as a teenager, then, to give them advice, you would ask them to think about which of those three, it might be one or two or three of those three areas they feel there's a problem with, and then to look, well, first to look at the various bits of advice that I have in my book, The Teenage Guide to Life Online, and also there's a lot of free information on my website, nicolamorgan.com, aimed at parents, mostly parents and teachers, but also very accessible for young people. From the point of view of the concentration and procrastination aspect, if they and we, anyone who's affected by this, can properly understand that it is a genuinely compulsive set of technologies for the reasons that I gave earlier. And because it's genuinely addictive, if we look then at how we would typically deal with other things that we feel compelled to use too much of, and apply the same principles there, then that can be helpful. So for example, if you were individually trying to, let's say, and I'm thinking of myself here, eat less chocolate, then you wouldn't, while you're working or while you're sitting, doing whatever, you would not put a bar of chocolate in front of you on the desk to tempt you, because if you're looking at it, you're going to be likely to want it. So in the same way as you wouldn't do that with chocolate, don't do that with your phone as well. So putting the phone out of the way, not just out of sight, but ideally, in a different room, make it as difficult as you possibly can to get to. Set guidelines for yourself about when you are allowed to use your phone and when you're not. There are also some bits of technology that you can use to help you focus. So there's a technique called Pomodoro, Pomodoro. There are some apps. There is a free app to do with that. You shouldn't need to pay for any apps for anything like this, but the Pomodoro technique is a very, very simple, but often simple is very effective. It's a technique that I use to keep myself on track when I'm meant to be working, but I'm being tempted to go onto whatever social media platform I use. It's just a technique involving a timer and telling yourself you're going to work for 25 minutes and you're not going to go on whatever your temptations are, and then at the end the timer rings and you're allowed to go and do whatever it is. And it sounds ridiculously simple, but it's remarkably effective. And there are some other techniques like that that are related to understanding the addictive power of screens. Also doing things as a group, so doing things as a family, as a household, setting rules as a household, and checking in with each other on how you're doing is a very effective way of dealing with overuse as well. And then with the self-esteem aspects, noticing when you're feeling bad, noticing what it is that somebody might say online that makes you feel bad, whether it's that you keep seeing somebody's perfect faces, perfect selfies or perfect life or perfect stories about what they did at the weekend. Well, mute those people, step away, go and do something else, go and say to your parent or your brother or sister or whatever, look, I'm not enjoying being on whatever it is at this time, or this is a conversation that's going on that's upsetting me, or this situation. And it's very easy, if you talk to someone else, for them to help you move away and just do something else fun and distracting and enjoyable, and ideally with other people, for a few minutes or an hour or a day or whatever it's going to take. But doing it with other people can be really helpful. Talking to other people how they feel about their self-esteem, because anybody who's been on certain social media platforms will be really familiar with that heart-sinking feeling of comparing yourself and what you perceive as your ordinary or problematic life against what you perceive as everybody else's perfect, wonderful lives, and remembering that people put their perfect and wonderful lives up. That's what, and let's name Instagram again, that's what Instagram is about. It's about putting your perfect, wonderful lives up. And we need to keep reminding each other that this is not reality. This is a very, very filtered, false, selected, edited snapshot of what somebody wants you to see about their marvelous life. And your life is marvelous too.
I think that's some excellent advice there, Nicola. One thing I wanted to ask was, we've talked about kind of putting away screens, but is it still okay to use things like a Kindle, like an ebook reader? Are those still okay, or do they have an impact as well?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question, a very good point. I do quite a lot of work with schools and parents on the science of reading for pleasure, and particularly I invented a word a few years ago called redaxation, which is the idea that reading for pleasure is, and there is evidence for this now, is a genuinely relaxing and stress reducing activity in certain circumstances. So yes, can we do it on screens, on an ebook reader perfectly healthily? Yes, in certain circumstances or with certain conditions. So Some people will read an ebook on a dedicated ebook reader like a Kindle, and there are others available. And that tends to be the best way of reading an ebook. But even then, those devices are sometimes connected to the internet and bring notifications. And if that's the case, if they're bringing notifications, then that can spoil the beneficial impact of that would come from you reading a book. The idea of reading a physical print book is that when you're doing, or an idea about it, is that when you're doing it, nothing else can come to you from that book, only the words. So it's your relationship with the words on the page. So if you've got an ebook reading device which it doesn't exactly replicate that, but which at least replicates the fact that nothing else is coming at you. So there are no notifications coming at you, there's no connection with the wider world, then that's absolutely fine. Some people worry a little bit about the fact that if you're reading on a screen before bed, they worry about whether the light from the screen is going to affect your sleep. And the evidence for that is a little bit complicated. If the screen is backlit, which most ebook readers dedicated ebook readers are not, but some are, and which most tablets, so iPads, etc., and all computers are. So backlit means that the light is coming from behind the screen, and that light is then, it's not all the same, but it typically is closer to the wavelength of daylight. So it typically alerts your brain to wake up and to think that it's daytime. So it can, for some people, negatively impact the ability to fall asleep. But in practice, people tend to find that that has a very small effect only, and sometimes not an effect at all. For me, the main reason for not using screens like tablets and computers before you go to bed is not the light they produce. I think the effect of that is small or negligible, but the fact that they might bring notifications or alerting, awaking information. No messages that you receive through a device are likely to help you go to sleep. They're likely to excite or annoy or alert you in some way. So basically, if the ebook reading device is not connected to anything that's going to bring in any notifications, and if the light that it's producing is dimmed or is set to be daylight, is set to be for nighttime, then that should not have a negative effect. But the key, as with all of these things, is actually to think about, again, honestly, how it affects you. So don't think, oh, well, she said that this is what would happen. Think about whether it actually is happening for you. So if reading an ebook on anything before you go to bed doesn't stop you falling asleep, and you fall asleep really quickly and stay asleep, then there's not a problem.
Thank you. I think that's a good vote in favour of print books. There's still a place for them.
Absolutely.
Which is good.
Well, actually, another thing that I forgot is that another kind of condition for me saying, yes, absolutely, reading on an ebook reader is perfectly fine, is, again, only if you personally find it just as easy to engage with the book, to get into it. Now, I've done surveys of this with people of all ages, and it doesn't seem to be age related. There are some people, I'm included in that group, who don't find it at all easy to get into the book, to dive into a book when it's on a screen. And we only find it easy to do that when we have the print book. There's something, and I do talks about this, but I won't go into the detail now. There is something different about a print book. But if you as an individual do find it easy to get properly engaged in and dive deeply into an ebook, then there's absolutely no problem at all. But for many people of all ages, print is the only way to engage, particularly in fiction.
fully switch off. And I liked your phrase, relaxation. I think that sums it up very nicely. It is that moment where you can step away from a screen and be uninterrupted. And that is very important. If we can just come back to the issue of distraction, and I think particularly as teenagers, we are very prone to distraction, and also to peer influence around, you know, what takes our interest. Do you have any guidance for teenagers in relation to, I suppose, their activities online? So aside from social media, you know, they will be using screens, they will be researching projects for school, they may be engaging with different groups. Do you, I suppose, consider that the time spent on those activities has the same impact in terms of distraction and self-esteem?
I think there's so much. We almost do everything online nowadays, and so there's such a variety that it's impossible really to compare like for like. And again, I think that even if we could do lots of bits of research that answered that question in lots of different ways, I still think it comes down to each of us as individuals thinking about how it seems to be affecting us, and each of us as individuals seeing if we think that we're doing enough of those 5 healthy activities that I mentioned earlier on. And I mean, I'm on my screens kind of almost all my working day, and I don't regard that as being a problem at all. It's no different in terms of physical health. So for example, someone who has a sedentary job, as I do and many people do, I don't think that being sedentary is unhealthy. I don't think it's more unhealthy that I'm doing my work on screen compared to if I was sitting at that same desk writing with a pen. So I think that the reasons for me to get up from my desk and go for a walk, or go and, you know, do some gardening or whatever it is, are equal. So screen time doesn't come into that. It's just that we do all that stuff during our working day, and the same, or almost the same, applies for young people at school. But then we go on in our evenings and our weekends to spend a lot of our time doing the same, effectively the same thing. But I still think that the self-esteem aspects that is more important. The social media side has more effects on self-esteem than those other things do. And think about all of the other things that we haven't even mentioned that you can do with your screen. So you can be incredibly creative, you can learn new creative skills, you can do artwork, you can make films and videos. So you can write, you can, you know, even as young people, as any ages, you can write books, you can write blogs, you can communicate with people all around the world. So there are incredibly important things that we can do. And in the Teenage Guide to Life Online, which by the way should be called Life Online, the word teenage guide got in there accidentally. Long story there. But in that book, on every topic apart from one, I have positives and negatives, and quite evenly balanced as well. It's not that I'm struggling to find positives about each topic, but on everything, whether it's to do with creativity or communication or whatever, there are positives and negatives. And the one topic where I couldn't find any positives was the effect of screens on sleep. They do seem to have a really negative effect on sleep. The only positive that I could find, and I was scraping the barrel, was that you could use your phone to learn about the negative effects of phones on sleep. So that was literally the only positive that I could find. But everything else, in terms of, you know, our knowledge, our ability to be tolerant. I mean, you talked rightly about the problems of being in your bubble, which implies that that is going to make people be more narrow-minded. But actually, when one of the first things that I started thinking about when I was thinking about this topic some years ago is how incredibly more tolerant and broad-minded and open-minded teenagers are today compared to me when I was a teenager, because I grew up in a very, very tiny community in rural England, and I had no contact with anyone other than the people in my school. I didn't have neighbors, I just didn't meet anyone different from me, anyone with different backgrounds or anything like that. And as I became a teenager, my worldview was horrendously narrow. But now teenagers hear and meet and talk to people from all over the world and all different cultures. And my daughters are in their early 30s now, but as they grew up, I saw that incredible difference between their outlook and tolerance and decency towards people and understanding of people different from themselves that was just opposite from how I was at their age. So that is a really, really positive thing, I think, about social media and screens. We wouldn't have that otherwise. There wouldn't be another way to have that understanding of so many other people.
I think that's a really, really nice way to bring all of this to a close, to end with a positive for all of it. So Nicola, can I say thank you very much for joining us today for the Healthy Ireland at Your Library with Galway Libraries. It's been an absolute pleasure dealing with you and speaking to you. We're very much looking forward to having your new books in. And for anyone who is watching, the books we currently have on our Healthy Ireland list and available to borrow are Blame My Brain, Positively Teenage, The Teenage Guide to Life Online, and The Teenage Guide to Stress. And those are available to borrow from any of our libraries. And we also have our online collection of Healthy Ireland books from BorrowBox, and those are available too. So thank you all for joining us, and we hope you will join us for our next session. Keep an eye on Facebook and YouTube, and we will have the information on those talks coming out for our January and February talks soon. Thank you.